Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada Sánchez de Bustamante, familiarly known as Goni, is a Bolivian politician and businessman, who served as President of Bolivia for 2 non-consecutive terms. He is a lifelong member of the Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario. As Minister of Planning in the government of President Víctor Paz Estenssoro, Sánchez de Lozada used shock therapy in 1985 to cut hyperinflation from an estimated 25,000% to a single digit within a period of less than 6 weeks. Sánchez de Lozada was twice elected President of Bolivia, both times on the Manera ticket. During his first term, he initiated a series of landmark social, economic and constitutional reforms. Elected to a second term in 2002, he struggled with protests and events in October 2003 related to the Bolivian gas conflict. Official reports said that 67 protesters, soldiers and policemen died. Most deaths were of protesters or bystanders in what was described as a massacre. He resigned and went into exile in the United States in October 2003. In March 2006, he resigned the leadership of the MANA. Bolivia has unsuccessfully been seeking his extradition from the U.S. to stand a political trial for the events of 2003. Victims' representatives have pursued compensatory damages for extrajudicial killings in a suit against him in the United States under the Alien Tort Statute. In 2014, the U.S. District Court in Florida ruled the case could proceed under the Torture Victim Protection Act. Both sides filed appeals on this ruling in 2015. Political life. The son of a political exile, Sánchez de Lozada spent his early years in the United States, where he attended boarding school at Scattergood Friends School in rural Iowa. He studied literature and philosophy at the University of Chicago. As a result of this experience, his Spanish is accented, leading many Bolivians to refer to him as El Gringo. At the age of 21, he returned to Bolivia in 1951, on the eve of the 1952 revolution led by the MANA political party. This transformed Bolivia from a semi-feudal oligarchy to a multi-party democracy by introducing universal suffrage, nationalizing the mines of the 3 tin barons, and carrying out sweeping agrarian reform. Sánchez de Lozada pursued filmmaking and participated in several cinematic projects in the 1950s, including filming Bolivia's 1952 revolution. In 1954 he founded Telecine. His film Voces de la Tierra won first prize for documentaries at the 1957 Edinburgh Film Festival. In 1957, Sánchez de Lozada turned to resource businesses, founding Andean Geoservices. In 1966, he founded the mining company COMSUR, later becoming one of the most successful mining entrepreneurs in the country. Bolivia was ruled for nearly 2 decades by military dictatorships. In 1979 and again in 1980, on the return to democracy, Sánchez de Lozada was elected to Congress as deputy for Cochabamba. In 1985, he was elected senator from Cochabamba and then as president of the Senate. Soon after, President Víctor Paz Estenssoro appointed him as planning minister. Sánchez de Lozada oversaw a series of economic structural reforms that steered the country away from state capitalism towards a mixed economy. He is particularly known for having sharply reduced the hyperinflation of the period, using economic shock therapy, as championed by United States economist Jeffrey Sachs, then of Harvard University. University. Sánchez de Lozada describes himself as a fiscal conservative and social progressive. Sánchez de Lozada ran for president in 1989 as the MANA candidate, while he won the plurality with 25.6% of the popular vote. In the congressional runoff among the top three candidates, Jaime Paz Zamora of the MIR, who had polled 21.8% of the popular vote and formerly been in third place, won the presidency. Paz Zamora was backed in the runoff by the second-placed, former military dictator Hugo Banzer of the ADN, who had won 25.2% of the popular vote. First presidency, 1993–97. In 1993, Sánchez de Lozada again ran for president, this time in alliance with the Tupac Katari Revolutionary Liberation Movement, an indigenous party formed in 1985 whose leader Victor Hugo Cardenas was the candidate for vice president. The MANA MRTKL ticket won the first plurality with 36.5% of the popular vote, and Sánchez de Lozada was confirmed as president by Congress. A coalition government that included the center-left Free Bolivia movement and populist Civic Solidarity Union was formed. With the 1993 electoral victory, Cardenas became the first elected indigenous vice president in South America. The 1993–97 MANA-led government initiated a series of constitutional, social, economic and political reforms. The constitution was rewritten to define Bolivia as a multi-ethnic and multicultural nation. The first articles enshrined indigenous rights. Other legislation included the Popular Participation Act, which decentralized the country by creating 311 municipal governments, empowering them for local governance. The law introduced direct municipal elections for the indigenous population, and authorized local decision-making on municipal spending, for which 20% of federal spending was guaranteed to the municipalities on a per capita basis. Other programs included educational reform, which introduced classroom teaching in the local indigenous languages, universal maternity coverage and milk and medical coverage for children up to the age of 5 years, and a universal old age annual benefit. Political reforms included opening elections to independent candidates for congressional seats, and capitalization, a program which enabled the formation of joint ventures by private capital and the Bolivian people, and requiring the private capital be invested directly in the new company. The capitalization program was controversial. It was perceived as a privatization of 5 major state-owned companies that ceded management of these industries to foreign interests. Supporters believed that the requirement for private capital to be directly invested in the new joint ventures significantly reduced room for corruption. The program was intended to provide for development of these strategic resources, as the Bolivian government could not afford to do so. The revenues of the new companies were expected to yield funds for human and social, as well as infrastructure development. The dividend payouts for the Bolivian people were the foundation of a universal, annual old age benefit, the BONOSOL. Although small on a per capita basis, it was expected to benefit primarily the rural elderly, the most marginalized sector of Bolivia's indigenous population. Finally, the reforms also included changes to the country's electoral laws. A new electoral system was introduced. The change opened elections for 70 congressional seats to independent candidates who were elected by plurality, with the remaining 60 seats to be filled proportionally by members of parties reflecting the votes cast for the presidential tickets. If no presidential candidate won an absolute majority, the president would be elected in a runoff of the top 2 contenders. The presidential term of office was set at 5 years. Second presidency, 2002–03. In 2002, Sánchez de Lozada again ran for president. He chose Carlos Mesa as his running mate, an independent historian and journalist who had Mana sympathies. Sánchez de Lozada hired U.S. political consultants James Carville, Stan Greenberg and Bob Schramm to advise his campaign. After running a sophisticated campaign, de Lozada seemed positioned to win a strong enough plurality to form a strong government. However, 3 days before the elections, the U.S. ambassador publicly warned the Bolivian people against electing those who want Bolivia to again be an exporter of cocaine, as it would threaten U.S. aid to Bolivia. The people reacted in resentment, swelling the anti-U.S. vote for Evo Morales in the last 3 days of the campaign by 9% and helping him finish second after de Lozada. Evo Morales of the Movement Towards Socialism received 20.94% of the popular vote. The center-right neo-populist candidate, Manfred Reyes of NFR, placed a close third with 20.91% of the popular vote. After a difficult coalition-building process, Sánchez de Lozada was elected in a coalition formed by the Mana MBL, MIR and UCS, the last two former members of the preceding coalition headed by the rightist, former dictator General Hugo Banzer. When Sánchez de Lozada took office, he was faced with an economic and social crisis inherited from the preceding administration. Economic growth had plunged from the 4.8% at the end of Sánchez de Lozada's first presidency to 0.6% in 1999 and had recovered to only 2% for 2002. The fiscal deficit was running at 8%. Gas war and resignation from his inauguration in August 2002 until the end of the year, there were fewer public tensions. In January 2003 and under the leadership of Evo Morales, a group of union leaders joined together to found the People's High Command. A new wave of heightened protests began. Main roads were blocked, and towns and cities were brought to a standstill. Some groups aired long-standing grievances against the government, others were targeted entirely locally, protesting against decisions of the now self-governing municipalities. In February, a standoff between police demanding higher pay and army units called to protect the presidential palace suddenly ended in violence and deaths in the streets of La Paz, without articulated demands. The acute economic crisis affected above all the urban workers and the farming indigenous populations. The struggles gave widespread support for protests and demands became more focused. The cocaleros continued protesting against eradication of a millinery plant, although Banzer's Coca Zero policy had been replaced by the earlier subsidized crop substitution policy, in order to achieve gradual coca reduction but not total eradication. The indigenous farmers of the La Paz Aymara region pressed for political reform, to include recognition and inclusion of Bolivia's indigenous ethnic groups as legitimate political blocs. They wanted economic decentralization based on recognition of indigenous groups as legitimate political actors. Other demands included autonomy for the territories. By contrast, urban workers, primarily in La Paz, and miners protested against the proceeds of increasing natural gas production going to foreigners. Demands rose for the government to return to the corporatist state and nationalize Bolivia's hydrocarbon resources. Protesters demanded Sánchez de Lozada's resignation. In late September, a convoy of buses and trucks under a police escort was bringing back to La Paz over 700 persons, including foreign tourists. After a 10-day blockade of a valley resort town, Inguarisata, confrontations between protesters blocking the road and the army led to 6 dead, among them 2 soldiers and a child aged 8, shot in her own house. Conscript Edwin Aguilar said that he and other soldiers were ordered to shoot anything that moved. A few days later, in early October, it was reported that President Sánchez de Lozada had decided to export Bolivia's gas to Mexico and the United States through a Chilean port. Notwithstanding strong public opposition, rancour continues to be high against Chile since Bolivia lost its coastal territory to them in the late 19th century War of the Pacific. Protesters blockaded the main highway from the city of El Alto, Bolivia down to neighboring La Paz. A massive demonstration and virtual siege of La Paz ensued. After 3 days, fuel and other essential supplies were dangerously low in La Paz. On October 11, President Sánchez de Lozada promulgated Supreme Decree 27,209, ordering the militarization of the gas plants and the transport of hydrocarbons. This decree was intended to protect the military, noting in the third article, whatever harm to property of persons that might be produced as an effect of fulfilling the objective of the Supreme Decree shall be compensated and guaranteed by the state. As a result, fully armed military troops were sent as a security force to open the way for diesel and gasoline cisterns to be transported through densely populated poor neighborhoods into La Paz. Protesters tried to block the convoys at several points along the route. Altino residents reported that government troops started shooting indiscriminately, killing a 5-year-old child and a pregnant mother. Sánchez de Lozada and some government ministers attributed the violence to an armed coup, but the Catholic Church and most civil groups described it as a massacre by government forces. Vice President Mesa publicly broke with Sánchez de Lozada, saying, "Neither as a citizen nor as a man of principles can I accept that, faced with popular pressure, the response should be death." Quote, the Minister for Economic Development also resigned. 20,000 Bolivians began to march on La Paz, demanding the president's resignation. Evo Morales supporters from Cochabamba tried to march into Santa Cruz, the largest city of the eastern lowlands, where support still remained for the president. They were turned back. While blaming the violence on narco-syndicalists, Sánchez de Lozada proposed a national dialogue. He promised to put export plans to a national referendum, but demands for his resignation continued to rise. According to official figures, a total of 67 civilian deaths resulted from the gas war, with around 400 persons wounded. Faced with rising anger at the deaths, and with coalition partner Manfred Reyes Villa withdrawing political support, Sánchez de Lozada offered his resignation on October 17 in a letter to be read at an emergency session of Congress. He left on a commercially scheduled flight for the United States. Trial of responsibility. In 2004, after a concerted campaign by the families of the victims and human rights groups, who gathered over 700,000 signatures on petitions, 2/3 of Bolivia's Congress voted to authorize a trial of responsibility of the exiled president. It was intended to determine whether Sánchez de Lozada and his cabinet ministers should be held legally responsible for the violence of the gas war. Supporters included many from the president's party, reflecting a broad consensus that the government bore prime responsibility for the deaths. The Attorney General's office took testimony from 12 ministers, who also attributed blame to Sánchez de Lozada, and carried out detailed preliminary investigations. The work included forensic studies, crime scene investigations, and eyewitness testimony. Evo Morales, one of the key protest leaders, voluntarily offered evidence. In August 2011, the Bolivian Supreme Court sentenced 5 members of the military and 2 politicians to between 3 and 15 years in prison for the role in the events of September and October 2003. Attempts at extradition. On November 11, 2008, Bolivia formally served the U.S. government with a request to extradite Sánchez de Lozada to Bolivia. The request was rejected by the U.S. State Department in 2012, based on the argument that Sánchez de Lozada's actions are not a crime in the USA, and that no dual criminality condition existed. It said that no U.S. president could be charged for crimes as defined by the Bolivian state. On November 10, 2009, the U.S. District Court in the Southern District of Florida ruled that the claims for charges of crimes against humanity against de Lozada had no case. The court ruled that charges of extrajudicial killings could be pursued in order to allow two related U.S. cases to progress against former President Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada de Bustamante and former Bolivian Defense Minister José Carlos Sánchez Bazaine. The plaintiffs in the cases, Mamani al. v. Sánchez de Lozada and Mamani al. v. Sánchez Bazaine, seek compensatory and punitive damages under the Alien Tort Statute. On May 20, 2014, Judge James Cohn ordered that plaintiffs' claims under the Torture Victim Protection Act could proceed because they sufficiently alleged facts that plausibly suggest that these killings were deliberate, and because they adequately alleged that defendants were responsible for the killings. The case was stayed on August 19, 2014 pending defendants' appeal of the district court's decision. Appellants' defendants filed the brief to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals on January 14, 2015. Plaintiffs' appellees filed their brief on March 6, 2015. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals issued the decision on June 17, 2016.